So I found this story at Foreign Policy, and it's so counter to what you'd usually expect them to say that I just had to make a video on it. Though it's an opinion piece where someone's making an argument, so I guess that explains a lot of why it's there. So anyway, here's the article. Modi was right, India isn't ready for free trade. Until the country can address its own economic problems, agreements like the RCEP may do more harm than good. So this is the article. In late October, India decided to pull out of a massive trade deal, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which would have included 16 countries and covered around 40% of the global economy. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced his decision at an RCEP summit held in Bangkok in early November. The negotiations, he said, failed to address India's outstanding issues and concerns. India's objections to the agreement aren't hard to understand. For one, India has trade deficits with 11 of the 15 other members, many of them sizable. Taking that into account, at the start of negotiations, India had demanded a three-tiered structure for phasing out its tariffs for different groups of countries. India would have provided an initial tariff reduction of 65% for ASEAN, and with a reduction of 15% phased in over a 10-year period. For countries like Japan and South Korea, which India already had trade agreements, the reduction would be 62% in items. The rest of RCEP members, including China, which doesn't currently have a trade agreement with India, would have received a reduction of 42%. Facing stiff opposition to its tiered approach, by 2017, India had an offer to liberalize tariffs on 74% of goods from China, Australia, and New Zealand, and up to 86% for other members. But the ASEAN nations and other RCEP members still wanted India to make deeper concessions and commit to tariff cuts of 92% across all countries. In 2019, the members indicated that India would also have to accept immediate elimination of import duties on more than one-fourth of items and trades once RCEP came into effect. As a country with one of the highest tariff rates in all imports among RCEP members, India would be among those making the largest cuts to get tariffs to zero. It also wasn't clear whether the benefits of the deal would make up for that cost. According to a new report by NTI Analog, an Indian government think tank, purchases of Indian exports have been more linked to changes in income in other countries than to changes in the prices of the goods themselves, resulting from trade concessions. On their own, tariff reductions by ECEP members countries would not necessarily likely significantly boost imports of Indian goods around the region. Another major issue for India was the potential that opening up its market to China, another RCEP member, would lead to a flood of cheap Chinese goods crowding out Indian-produced products. Yes, that is a significant possibility. Right now, real wages in China are about double that of India, and India's currency is probably devalued by 30% compared to Chinese currency, so the labor cost factor would probably be 3 times higher in China than India. But on the other hand, to counter that, China has much more developed industrial agglomerations with more deeply developed supply chains, so they get a cost advantage from their superior economics of scale because their industrial supply chains and infrastructure is more strongly set up. So because all stages of the supply chain are more developed, there are more different factories closer together, so it has a lower transportation cost advantage, and also has superior economics of scale because infrastructure and other key supports, their costs are pooled among a larger group of industries, lowering the production prices for goods produced in China. So because of these factors in China's more developed industry and supply chains, China has the superior cost advantage that makes up for its higher labor cost, and could therefore make it much more easier for China to outcompete India and giving it an advantage over Indian industry. India's trade deficit with China accounts for about 50% of the country's total trade deficit, and the gap has grown tremendously since China's secession to the World Trade Organization in 2001. India was legitimately concerned about what a second wave of opening up would do to the existing deficit, one that developed even without a free trade agreement with China. So as you can see, imports from China have soared tremendously as China got more developed and now makes everything, while exports from India to China grew a little bit, but they haven't grown at all for the past decade, and they've only grown to like a fraction of what it imports from China. And that's because even though China has larger wages, because its industry in general is more developed, and it has that time to build like more industry, more factories, China has a superior economics of scale and more deeply developed supply chains that allow its industry to produce at a huge cost advantage to India in spite of its generally higher labor cost. So because China has more factories, the infrastructure costs are pooled among a larger number of factories, allowing it to produce at cheaper cost. And more factories means more stages of the supply chain are all located in the same city, which means substantially lower transportation costs to produce a finished good from start to finish. While if India has a lower level of factories, then that means the odds of its supply chains not being entirely filled in the same region are increased, so its factories have to deal with much higher transportation costs in total to produce the finished projects. And both those economics of scale and lower transportation costs in their agglomeration economies ultimately give China a huge cost advantage over a less developed country like India, in spite of China's higher labor cost. And I think that explains why China is more fundamentally competitive than India, and why China exports a lot more to India, while it's not reciprocally importing nearly as much stuff from India. To protect its domestic industries from surges in cheaper imports, especially from China, India has been negotiating with the RCEP members for a mechanism that would automatically snap back safeguard duties on imports if a certain threshold to be mutually decided by members were closed. India had wanted a system that would kick in automatically, so any damage to its economy could be contained immediately, but there was no agreement on this issue. Another problem for India is that, even with a safeguard against soaring direct Chinese imports, Chinese goods could still have found their way into Indian market via third countries if the RCEP's rules of origin were not tightened, as demanded by India. India had preferred requiring a value added of greater than 25% for an exporter to count as the country of origin of a particular product. But the RCEP rules instead allow value addition to take place in any of the member countries. A final contentious issue with the RCEP was related to the trade investments and intellectual property rights. India had objected to the inclusion of a controversial investor-state dispute settlement mechanism that would allow larger multinational firms to challenge India's domestic laws. Okay, so this is issues with intellectual property. Beyond the specific issues with the RCEP, India's past experience with the regional trade agreements had given the country little reason to expect the benefits of free trade would make up for the challenges. India has 15 existing trade agreements. The signing of each has led to greater bilateral trade, with imports increasing substantially more than exports, according to the Niti Aayog report. In turn, India has made no net gains from past agreements. To be sure, part of the reason is its own inverted duty structure, which taxes imported finished goods at a lower rate than raw materials, making Indian construction goods uncompetitive. Without substantial changes to its own tax code, the new agreement could do the same. Yeah, so if India is taxing raw materials higher than final consumer goods, then that's just a really bad policy, and that's going to hurt itself. That's why many Indian businesses and agricultural interests had been wary of the country joining the RCEP and were putting increasing pressure on New Delhi to protect domestic manufacturing. The farming community had also appealed to the government to keep agricultural products out of the RCEP. Modi's decision to opt out of the agreement entirely was hailed by the steel, auto, copper, and aluminum industries in particular. In truth, Indian manufacturing is simply not equipped to take on competition from outside, and that relates to the failures to undertake reforms at home. India's manufacturing output has been stagnant at 15% of GDP for several years, despite attempts to increase the share. Indian manufacturers face supply-side constraints such as lack of proper infrastructure, roads are poor, energy shortages are common, and so on. That's part of what I was saying earlier. Though even if India did have infrastructure, because it has less industry in general, those infrastructure costs are pooled among a smaller amount of factories, meaning that the per factory costs for the final goods are higher, while because the infrastructure costs are pooled among a larger number of factories in China, the individual costs per final good are spread out more, making the Chinese goods cheaper and therefore more competitive. So even if India had the same infrastructure as China, because it has less industry in general, its final cost would still be less competitive. According to India's 2018 economic survey, logistics costs in the country are estimated at about 13 to 14% of GDP, as compared to about 8% in developed countries. Meanwhile, inflexible labor laws incentivize firms to grow beyond a limited size and thus compete globally. However, given the current state of the economy, it is witnessing its slowest growth in many years and is suffering from a lack of demand. The government's decision makes sense as a short-term way to protect the country from further outside shocks. If it wants to fare better in the longer term, though, India should take the opportunity to reform its domestic policies and streamline it so it can reap the intended rewards. So this is why this guy's arguing that free trade would be bad for India, because India has more undeveloped industry that just cannot compete at the same level because of factors like higher transportation costs, because it has less influential supply chains. Because India has less industry in general, factories on average are going to be more spread out, which means factories at different stages of the same supply chain are going to be more likely to be further apart. Different factories at stages of production are on average located farther from each other, leading to higher transportation costs, and the cost of infrastructure are pooled among a smaller number of factories, meaning each factory has to pay a higher infrastructure cost to foot the bill for the same infrastructure, and those factors would make industry in less developed economies like India less fundamentally competitive than in more developed places like China, even though India still has probably lower labor costs. So that's why free trade may have costs outweigh the benefits. And I think that's it for the article, and that's all I have to say. If you like this video, please like it, leave your thoughts in the comments section, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with anyone else you can think of. I think that's it.